Previously, we saw how to prepare a pattern and the fabric, as well as how to cut and mark the pieces. Now we're going to put the pieces together to make the bodice of our dress. The first step, according to the directions, is to fold the sash along the fold line with the right sides together. The fold line on this piece is right down the middle, so I didn't bother marking it. The right side of this fabric is the pretty shiny side. It's important to note that most fabrics have a right side and a wrong side, but not all. The wool for my son's winter cloak had no distinction. It was the same on both sides. And by the way, he loves that cloak. He wears it. He actually had to walk several miles home from work one night during a snowstorm because his ride forgot him. And that wool cloak kept him very warm and dry in spite of it being covered in 2 inches of snow and ice when he got home. So, something to be said for wool. After we folded the sash and pinned the edges together, the directions say to stitch the long edge starting at the point. On this pattern, there's a 5/8 inch seam allowance built into the pattern. So we stitch 5/8 inch from that edge unless the instructions indicate otherwise. That white thing is a seam allowance guide. It's set to 5/8 inch so I can run my fabric against it. One of these days I'll get a magnetic guide, but this'll do for now. We're starting at the point and working our way down the long side. To turn the corner, stop the machine using the wheel on the side and leaving the needle down in the fabric. Lift the presser foot, rotate the fabric around the needle, then lower the foot. I like to stop the machine when pulling out pins because I'm clumsy. If you stop your machine, be sure to do it with the needle down. This will prevent your fabric from slipping away from your seam line. So we have a couple of options now because we can't backstitch. We can either turn the fabric around and go over that for a 1/4 inch or so, or we can leave the ends long, put a needle through it and tie a knot. Another trick that people use is they lift up the foot just a hair so that it can't move, and then they stitch a few stitches that way. I'm going to go the turnaround because it's kind of easier and more reliable. Now remove the fabric, trim the threads, and repeat for the second sash. I won't bore you with that one. Now that we've stitched our 2 sashes, we need to trim the seams and turn them right side out. We'll clip off the corner at the tip without clipping the stitches, and we'll trim the seam allowance to about a 1/4 inch from that seam. This will allow the sash to lie flat and will prevent unsightly bulk. After that, we turn the sashes right side out. Look at there. I think we've got it. We'll use this little tool to turn the points and make them nice and crisp. I'll do the second sash off camera and we'll press these flat. And here we have the 2 sashes. So it looks like the next step is going to be to attach those sashes to the bodice front at the sides, matching the symbols, and then we're going to baste those together. And now we're attaching the bodice back to the front by stitching the sides together. Notice that we're not yet attaching the bodice lining. Until I made this dress, I had no idea how the bodice lining was done. Next, I stitched together the pieces of the lining. They're identical to the bodice except for the sashes. I pressed the seams open and folded up the bottom edge toward the inside. The instructions were a little vague, but the next step was to pin the lining to the bodice with the right sides together. It was a little fiddly, but we got it done. Here's what it looked like at this point. We're going to do the neckline and the armholes, but we're not going to do down the sides, which is actually the back. We're not going to do the bottom, and we're actually not going to do across the shoulders yet. So I've sewn the lining to the bodice, and I had mentioned previously that we're using the same fabric for both. And now it is time to trim the seams. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm finding these seams. It said to sew the seams below the small dot, which I did, and that leaves this pretty big spot right here that's not stitched. So I've outlined where the stitching line is with white chalk so that you can see it and so that I can see it. And I'm going to go ahead and trim there before I do the next step. I'm using a small rotary tool. This was $1.25 at the Dollar Tree and works very well for those tight curves. I'm trimming the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. At the underarm seam, we're only trimming where we stitched. The rest of that seam allowance will be needed later. And here we are, ready for the next step. I need to quickly clip the curves close to the seam so that the garment will lie flat when turned right side out. After that, we'll understitch the neckline as far as we can. This will give the neckline a more finished look and will prevent it from shifting when worn, I guess. I'm not sure because I've never even heard of understitching before making this dress, and I've made quite a few dresses. Instead, I've always top stitched very close to the edge. As I said, I'd never heard of understitching, so I looked it up. I started with this book. The process was in there, but the wording was so confusing that it was no help at all. Then I spent some time on YouTube, where several videos combined to clear the fog. Basically, understitching is turning the seam allowance toward the lining and stitching it down very close to the seam, but on the lining side. This way the lining is held in place and the stitches are not visible from the outside of the garment. This is very fiddly, and to stitch along the entire seam is impossible with my machine. In future, I'll top stitch, even on formal attire. This is what it looks like on the inside, and this is the outside. The stitching is on the lining only. I did that with all the seams I could reach. Next is to turn the garment right side out and press all the new seams. You cannot get away from ironing while sewing. It's my least favorite part of sewing, but it must be done. Because this is a synthetic material, I'm using a rather low heat setting. I'm being careful to push the seams all the way out and then roll them inward just a hair so they're invisible from outside. Now we're ready to pin the shoulders together. This was slightly confusing from the directions on the pattern, but I worked through it. It's actually pretty simple to do. I'll make a separate video showing how to sew shoulder seams with a lining. It deserves its own video. And now to actually stitch them together. Be sure to backstitch at the end. All that's left is to press our bodice one more time. We won't do the sides yet because we're inserting a zipper after the skirt is attached. I didn't get video of this step. I don't remember why. I recommend using a tailor's ham for these curvy bits. It makes pressing anything with a curve much easier than pressing on a flat surface. And here we are, 2 days worth of work, edited down to just over 12 minutes. Be sure to come back for the next step, and thanks for watching.